Ladies and gentlemen, please, meet David Sedaris.
Thank you for having me. I was going to read a story called Laugh Kookaburra that was published in the New Yorker and has not appeared in our book. I've been to Australia twice so far, but according to my father, I've never actually seen it. He made this observation at the home of my cousin Joan, whom he and I visited just before Christmas, and it came on the heels of an equally aggressive comment. Well, he said, David's a better reader than he is a writer. This from someone who hasn't opened a book since Dave Stockton's putt to win in 1996. He's never been to Australia either. Never even come close. No matter, he told me. In order to see the country, you have to see the countryside, and you've only been to Sydney. And Melbourne. And Brisbane, I said, and I have too gone to the country. Like hell you have. All right, I said, let's get Hugh on the phone. He'll tell you. He'll even send you pictures. Joan and her family live in Binghamton, New York. They don't see my father and me that often, so it was pretty lousy to sit at their table, he and I bickering like an old married couple. Ashamed by the bad impression we were making, I dropped the countryside business, and as my dad moved on to other people's shortcomings, I thought back to the previous summer in my 23-hour flight from London to Sydney. I was in Australia on business, and because someone else was paying for the ticket and it would be possible to stop in Japan on our way home, Hugh joined me. This is not to put Australia down, but we'd already gone once before. Then, too, spend that much time on a plane and you're entitled to a whole new world when you step off at the other end. The planet Mercury, say, or at the very least, Mexico City. For an American, though, Australia seems pretty familiar. Same wide streets, same office towers. It's Canada in a thong. Or at least that's the initial impression. I hate to admit it, but my dad was right about the countryside. Hugh and I didn't see much of it, but we wouldn't have seen anything were it not for a woman named Pat, who was born in Melbourne and has lived there for most of her life. We'd met her a few years earlier in Paris, where she'd come to spend a mid-July vacation. Over drinks in our living room, her face dewed with sweat, she taught us the term shout, as in, I'm shouting lunch. This means that you're treating and that you don't want any lip about it. You can also say, it's my shout, or I'll shout the next round, she told us. We kept in touch after her visit, and when my work was done and I was given a day and a half to spend as I liked, Pat offered herself as a guide. On that first afternoon, she showed us around Melbourne and shouted coffee. The following morning, she picked us up at our hotel and drove us into what she called the bush. I expected a wasteland of dust and human bones. But in fact, it was nothing like that. When Australians say the bush, they mean the woods, the forest. First, though, we had to get out of Melbourne and drive beyond the seemingly endless suburbs. It was August, the dead of winter, and so we had the windows rolled up. The homes we passed were made of wood, many with high fences around the backyards. They didn't look exactly like American houses, but I couldn't quite identify the difference. Was it the roofs, I wondered? The siding? Pat was driving, and as we passed the turnoff for a shopping center, she invited us to picture a 4-burner stove. Gas or electric, Hugh asked, and she said that it didn't matter. This was not a real stove, but a symbolic one, used to prove a point at a management seminar she had once attended. 1 burner represents your family, 1 is your friends, the 3rd is your health, and the 4th is your work. The gist, she said, was that in order to be successful, you have to cut off 1 of your burners. And in order to be really successful, you have to cut off 2. Pat has her own business, a good one that's allowing her to retire at 55. She owns 3 houses and 2 cars, But even without the stuff, she seems like a genuinely happy person, and that alone constitutes success. I asked which 2 burners she had cut off, and she said that the first to go had been family. After that, she switched off her health. How about you? I thought for a moment and said that I'd cut off my friends. It's nothing to be proud of, but after meeting Hugh, I quit making an effort. And what else? She asked. Health, I guess. Hugh's answer was work. And? Just work, he said. I asked Pat why she'd cut off her family, and with no trace of bitterness, she talked about her parents, severe alcoholics, the both of them. They drank away their jobs and credit. Because they were broke, they moved a lot, most often in the middle of the night. This made it hard to have a pet, though for a short time, Pat and her sister managed to own a sheep. It was an old beat-up ram they named Mr. Preston. He was lovely and good-natured until my father sent him off to be shorn, Pat said. When he returned, there were bald patches and horrible deep cuts like stab wounds in his skin. Then we moved to an apartment and had to get rid of him. She looked at her hands on the steering wheel. Poor old Mr. Preston. I hadn't thought about him in years. It was around this time that we finally entered the bush. Hugh pointed out the window at a still lump of dirty fur lying beside a fallen tree, and Pat caroled, "Roadkill!" Then she pulled over so we could take a closer look. Since leaving Melbourne, we'd been climbing higher into the foothills. The temperature had dropped, and there were graying patches of snow on the ground. I had on a sweater and a jacket, but they weren't quite enough, and I shivered as we walked toward the body and saw that it was a what exactly? A teenage kangaroo? A wallaby, Pat corrected me. The thing had been struck but not run over. It hadn't decomposed or been disfigured, and I was surprised by the shoddiness of its coat. It was as if you'd bred a rabbit with a mule. Then there was the tail, which reminded me of a lance. "Hugh," I called, "come here and look at the wallaby." It's his belief that in marveling at a dead roadside animal, you may as well have killed it yourself. Not accidentally, but on purpose. Cackling, most likely, as you ran it down. Therefore, he stayed in the car. "It's your loss," I called. And a great cloud of steam issued from my mouth. Our destination that afternoon was a place called Daylesford, which looked, when we arrived, more like a movie set than an actual working town. The buildings on the main street were 2 stories tall and made of wood, like buildings in the Old West, but brightly painted. Here was the shop selling handmade soaps shaped like pettifours. Here was the fudgery, the jammery, your source for moisturizer. If Dodge City had been founded and maintained by homosexuals, this is what it might have looked like. "The spas are fantastic," Pat said. And she parked the car in front of a puppet shop. From there, we walked down a slight hill, passing a flock of sulfur-crested cockatoos, just milling about, pulling worms from the front lawn of a bed and breakfast. This was a moment when familiarity slipped away, and Australia seemed not just distant, but impossibly foreign. "Will you look at that?" I said. It was Pat who had made the lunch reservation. The restaurant was attached to a hotel, and on arriving, we were seated beside a picture window. The view was of a wooden deck, and immediately beyond it, a small lake. On a sunny day, it was probably blinding, but the winter sky was like brushed aluminum. The water beneath it had the same dull sheen, and its surface reflected nothing. Even before the menus were handed out, you could see what sort of a place this was. Order the pork, and it might resemble a rough-hewn raft, stranded by tides on a narrow beach of polenta. Fish might come with shredded turnips or a pablum of coddled fruit. The younger an ingredient, the more highly it was valued, thus the baby chicken. the baby spinach, the newborn asparagus, each pale stalk as slender as a fang. As always in a fancy restaurant, I asked Hugh to order for me. Whatever you think, I told him, just so long as there's no chocolate in it. He and Pat weighed our options, and I watched the hostess seat a party of 8. Bringing up the rear was a woman in her mid-30s, pretty and with a baby on her shoulder. Its back was covered with a shawl, but to judge from the size, it looked extremely young, a month old, tops. Keep it away from the chef, I thought. Hugh showed me a funny word combination on the menu, and then I returned my attention to the table of newcomers and saw that the child had not shifted position. Its mother was running her hand over its back, almost as if she were feeling for a switch. And when the top of the shawl fell away, I saw that this was not a baby, but a baby doll. Psst, I whispered. And when Pat raised her eyes, I directed them to the other side of the room. Is that normal in Australia? I asked. Maybe it's a grieving thing, she offered. Maybe she lost a baby in childbirth, and this is helping her to work through it. There's a definite line between looking and staring. And after I was caught crossing it, I turned toward the window. On the highest rail of the deck was a wooden platform, and standing upon it, looking directly into my eyes, was what I knew to be a kookaburra. The thing was as big as a seagull, but squatter, squarer, and all done up in earth tones, the complete spectrum from beige to dark walnut. When seen full on, the feathers atop his head looked like brush-cut hair, and that gave him a brutish, almost a conservative look. If owls were the professors of the avian kingdom, then kookaburras, I thought, might well be the gym teachers. When the waitress arrived, I pointed out the window and asked her a half a dozen questions, all of them fear-based. Oh, she said, that bird's not going to hurt anybody. She took our orders, and then she must have spoken to one of the waiters. He was a tall fellow, college age, and he approached our table with a covered bowl in his hands. I assumed it was an appetizer, but it seemed instead that it was for the kookaburra. Would you like to step outside and feed him? He asked. I wanted to say that between the wallaby and the baby doll, I was already overstimulated. But how often in life do you get such an offer? That's how I found myself out on the deck, holding what turned out to be a bowl of raw duck meat, cut into slender strips. At the sight of it, the bird stood up and flew onto my arm, which buckled slightly beneath his weight. Don't be afraid, the waiter said. And he talked to the kookaburra in a soothing, respectful voice, the way you might to a child with a switchblade in his hand. For that's what this thing's beak was, a serious weapon. I held a strip of raw duck, and after yanking it from my fingers, the bird flew back to the railing. Then he took the meat and began slamming it against his wooden platform. Whap! 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 Over and over, as if he were tenderizing it. This is what he'd do in the wild with snakes and lizards and such, the waiter said. He thinks it's still alive, see? He thinks he's killing it. The kookaburra must have slammed the meat against the wooden platform a good 10 times. Only then did he swallow it and look up expectantly for more. I took another strip from the bowl, and the action repeated itself. Whap! 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 On or about his third helping, I got used to the feel of a bird on my arm and started thinking about other things. Starting with the word kookaburra. I first heard it in the 5th grade when our music teacher went on an Australian kick. She taught us to sing Waltzing Matilda, Tie Me Kangaroo Down, and what we called simply kookaburra. Taken as a whole, I had never heard such craziness in my life. The first song, for instance, included the words Jumbok, Billabong, Swagman, and Tucker Bag, none of which were ever explained. The more nonsensical the lyric, the harder it was to remember. And that, most likely, is why I retained the song about the kookaburra. It was less abstract than the others. I recall that after school that day, I taught it to my sister Amy, who must have been in the first grade at the time. We sang it in the car, we sang it at the table, and then one night we sang it in her bed, the two of us laying side by side and rocking back and forth. Kookaburra sits in the old gum tree. We'd been at it for half an hour when the door flung open. What the hell is going on? It was our father, one hand resting teapot style on his hip, and the other, what would be the spout, formed into a fist. He was dressed in his standard around-the-house outfit, which is to say, his underpants. No matter the season, he wore them without a shirt or socks, the way a toddler might pad about in a diaper. For as long as any of us could remember, this was the way it went. He returned home from work and stepped out of his slacks, sighing with relief, as if they were oppressive, like high heels. All said, my father looked good in his underpants. Better than the guys in the Penny's catalog, who were, in my opinion, consistently weak in the leg department. Silhouetted in the doorway, he resembled a wrestler. Maybe not one in tip-top condition, but he was closer than any of the other dads on our street. It's 1 o'clock in the morning, for God's sake. David, go to your room. Lou Sedaris claiming it was 1 a.m. meant that it was, at best, 10:30. Still, there was no point in arguing. Down in the basement, I went to my room, and he resumed his position in front of the TV. Within a few minutes, he was snoring, and I crept back upstairs to join Amy for another 20 rounds. Kookaburra sits in the old gum tree. Merry, merry king of the bush is he. It didn't take long for our father to rally. Did I not tell you to go to your room? What would strike me afterwards was the innocence of it. If I had children and they stayed up late, singing a song about a bird, I believe I would find it charming. I knew I had those two for a reason, I think I'd say to myself. I might go so far as to secretly record them and submit the tape in a My Kids Are Cuter Than Yours competition. My dad, by contrast, clearly didn't see it that way, which was strange to me. It's not like we were ruining his TV reception. He couldn't even hear us from that distance. So what did he have to complain about? All right, Sonny, I'm giving you 10 seconds. 1, 2. I guess what he resented was being dismissed. Had our mother told us to shut up, we probably would have done it. Him, on the other hand, sitting around in his underpants, it just didn't seem that important. At the count of 6, I pushed back the covers. I'm going, I spat. And once again, I followed my father downstairs. 10 minutes later, I was back. Amy cleared a space for me, and we picked up where we had left off. Laugh, kookaburra, gay your life must be. Actually, maybe it was that last bit that bothered him. An 11-year-old boy in bed with his sister, not just singing about a bird, but doing it as best he could, rocking back and forth, and imagining himself on stage, possibly wearing a cape, and performing before a multitude. The third time he came into the room, our father was a wild man. Even worse, he was wielding a prop, the dreaded fraternity paddle. It looked like a beaver's tail made out of wood. In my memory, there were Greek letters burned into one side, and crowded around them were the signatures of other beta epsilons, men we'd never met, with old-fashioned nicknames like Lefty and Slivers. names to me as synonymous with misfortune as Smith and Wesson. Our father didn't bring out the paddle very often, but when he did, he always used it. All right, you, let's get this over with. Amy knew that she had nothing to worry about. He was after me, the instigator, and so she propped herself against the pillows, drawing up her legs as I scooted to the other side of the bed, then stood there, dancing from foot to foot. It was the worst possible strategy, as evasion only made him angrier. Still, who in his right mind would surrender to such a punishment? He got me eventually, the first blows landing just beneath my kneecaps. Then down I went, and he moved in on my upper thigh. Whap! 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 And while it certainly hurt, I have to say that he didn't go overboard. He never did. I asked him about it once when I was around 14, and he chalked it up to a combination of common sense and remarkable self-control. I know that if I don't stop myself early, I'll kill you. As always, after a paddling, I returned to my room, vowing never to talk to my father again. To hell with him. To hell with my mother, who'd done nothing to stop him. To hell with Amy for not taking a few licks herself. And to hell with the others who were, by now, certainly whispering about it. I didn't have the analogy of the stovetop back then, but what I'd done was turn off the burner marked family. Then I'd locked my door and sat there simmering, knowing even then that without them, I was nothing. Not a son or a brother, but just a boy. And how could that ever be enough? As a full-grown man, it seems no different. Cut off your family, and how would you know who you are? Cut them off in order to gain success, and how could that success be measured? What would it possibly mean? I thought of this as the kookaburra, finally full, swallowed his last strip of duck meat and took off over the lake. Inside the restaurant, our first courses had arrived, and I watched through the window as Hugh and Pat considered their plates. I should have gone inside right then, but I needed another minute to take it all in and acknowledge, if only to myself, that I really did have it made. A storybook town on the far side of the world. Enough in my pocket to shout a fancy lunch, and the sound of that bird in the distant trees, laughing, laughing. Esquire magazine put out a special style issue, and maybe because I don't have any, they asked me to contribute. The essay I wrote was arranged into different little chapters, and this was one of them, called With a Pal Like This, Who Needs Enemies? I've always liked the idea of accessories, those little pick-me-ups designed to invigorate what has come to feel drab and predictable. A woman might rejuvenate her outfit with a vintage Hermes scarf or a jaunty rope belt, but the options for men aren't nearly so interesting. I have no use for cufflinks or suspenders, and while I'll occasionally pick up a new tie, it hardly leaves me feeling kicky. Hidden accessories can do the trick, but again, they're mainly the province of women. Garter belt and lingerie, yes. Sock garter and microbrief, no. It was my search for something discreet, masculine, and practical that led me to the Stadium Pal, an external catheter currently being marketed to sports fans, truck drivers, and anyone else who's tired of searching for a bathroom. At first inspection, the device met all my criteria. Was it masculine? Yes. And proudly so. Knowing that no sensible female would ever voluntarily choose to pee in her pants, the manufacturers went ahead and designed the product exclusively for men. Unlike a regular catheter, which is inserted directly into the penis, the Stadium Pal connects by way of a self-adhesive condom, which is then attached to a flexible rubber tube. Urine flows through the tube and collects in the Freedom leg bag. conveniently attached to the user's calf. The bag can be emptied and reused up to 12 times, making it both disgusting and cost-effective. And what could be manlier? Was it discreet? According to the brochure, unless you wore it with shorts, no one needed to know anything about it. Was it practical? At the time, yes. I don't drive or attend football games, but I did have a book tour coming up, and the possibilities were endless. 5 glasses of iced tea, followed by a long public reading? Thanks, Stadium Pal. The window seat on an overbooked coast-to-coast flight? Don't mind if I do. I ordered myself a Stadium Pal and realized that while it might make sense in a hospital, it really wasn't very practical for day-to-day use. In an open-air sporting arena, a piping hot 32-ounce bag of urine might go unnoticed. But not so in a stuffy airplane or a small crowded bookstore. An hour after christening it, I smelled like a nursing home. On top of that, I found that it was hard to pee and do other things at the same time. Reading out loud, discussing my beverage options with a flight attendant, checking into a fine hotel. Each activity required its own separate form of concentration. And while no one knew exactly what I was up to, it was pretty clear that something was going on. I think it was my face that gave me away. That and my oddly swollen calf. What ultimately did me in was a self-adhesive condom. Putting it on was no problem, but its removal qualified as what, in certain cultures, is known as a bris. Wear it once and you'll need a solid month to fully recover. It will likely be a month in which you'll weigh the relative freedom of peeing in your pants against the unsightly discomfort of a scab-covered penis. Ultimately realizing that in terms of a convenient accessory, you're better off with the new watch band.